This computer. All right, ready to go? Yep. All right, welcome to the Coaching Collective podcast. So today we are very lucky to be graced by the presence of Luke Miller, a coach located in the US, Texas. I was lucky enough to head over to Dubai and work with him in the month of January, and obviously to meet him. And thank you for jumping on today. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys having me on, especially like after getting to talk with you in Dubai, and then obviously us having the consult a couple weeks back. I know where y'all's heads are at, and I know it'll kind of lead to a productive conversation today. So I'm kind of looking forward to diving in. But a little bit about me. No Switch Fitness is my company, it's my brand. So it's everything that I do, my coaching and educating kind of through. I also educate for J3 University. I was in the primary educator alongside John Jewett for that. I have a lot of my courses on there, like the female module, the applied hypertrophy optimization module. Obviously, we have J3U. So that's kind of like the two main things about me as far as like what I do in the industry. But coaching is my heart. Coaching is what I love. I definitely get a lot out of that process of taking an athlete and developing them through the levels of competing. It's just like nowadays I'm starting with people a lot higher. So typically I'm taking on people kind of at that national level and trying to work them into the pro ranks. So it's a lot of fun. I love what I do. I've got a staff of coaches that work under me as well. So yeah, truly blessed to be able to change people's lives through coaching and educating.
Yeah, and that's the best part, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just like the amount of impact it has started to become a part of what we do is wild to think of. If you think just like where I was 5 years ago, it's crazy.
So you mentioned that you've taken a lot of bodybuilders through the ranks, and you've got a lot now who are a little bit more advanced. So you obviously started off with more entry level competitors and worked their way up. Did you want to tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so starting in business for me was kind of came out of the back end of me competing. So I actually didn't start coaching until after I competed 4 times. So I had done the process plenty of times myself and kind of went through the variations of that process. And actually two of my first 3 clients were competitors for a contest prep.
That works out, yeah.
And it worked out fairly well, where I was like, oh man, I'm actually pretty good at this and I enjoy it. So that was kind of the start for me, man. Once I started the coaching business, I got, some first time competitors fairly quickly. And then I spent a lot of years just kind of coaching in the volume of like 20 to 30 clients around that kind of like overall load. And then I'd say probably 2020 was the year that I kind of broke through and really escalated that. So I've been coaching since 2016. And that was kind of the year that I had the most wins, which then translated to more business success. And then, so it was a lot of work to get where I'm at now. But that was kind of the start for me. Is I started coaching competitors very early. I was surprised at how fast they came, but it was a process that I had spent a lot of time learning about by that point. And so it just kind of translated fairly easily.
Have you always just coached competitors?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, I in the past, I don't do gym pop anymore. I have coaches on staff that do that for me. The gym pop people work directly with them, but I did have some starting out. Obviously, you're just trying to pay your bills, right? So I'd probably say back then I was coaching 50-50, 50% lifestyle, 50% competitors, where now it's like 100% competitors. So of my client load, I have probably 1 client that's Gen Pop, and that's just because he's been with me since the beginning. So it's like it's just grandfathered in, and I love him to death. He's a great guy. So that's kind of the dynamic of my coaching now. It's like it's nobody that's not a competitor on my roster anymore.
Yep.
So I think I remember you saying you had like 100 plus on the roster, correct?
Yeah, so I brought it down some. So I set it around 120 right now. That's kind of where I operate best at. And obviously I have a kid on the way. So I'm like 2 to 3 weeks out from my first kid. So I'm trying not to let that number drift up anymore, which is where the coaches on staff kind of come in, because I operate fairly well with around 150. It's probably like my peak limit.
Yeah.
But I like 120 from like a life balance standpoint. It's just
Yeah.
I can invest everything into everyone that I work with, which is very important for me. But then I can also have that time for my family and be able to do that kind of stuff because I just work a lot, man. Like it's just what every single day. And so there comes a point where you have to see the bigger vision of business development being outside of yourself, and that comes with developing others. And so that's kind of where a lot of my business direction is heading right now.
Yeah, the reason I did ask that is because I was going to ask 120 competitors would be work.
It's a lot. My day starts out at 5:30 every day, and I wake up, go to Starbucks, grab a coffee, and I'm at my computer by 5:45. I'm pretty much working until the end of the day most days.
Yeah, sort of the sacrifices you make, though. I can definitely relate. Yeah, I can definitely relate. Yeah, no, cool. That's awesome. So so you pretty much just got straight into coaching. So you didn't start PT floor or anything like that.
I did for a little bit. So I actually ran. It was kind of while I was coaching in the early years. So I actually ran a PT department for a box gym that in the area that I was living at the time. So I was like the PT manager. So I did all the education for the personal trainers, but I also trained people on the gym floor. But I would say like I trained people in person before I started coaching online, because while these people weren't paying me, people were coming to train with me to learn already. So it was like I was already doing it without realizing it. And then I just learned that, I can do this for a living. So that's kind of where the coaching business started. So technically, yes, I was coaching online, but I had been coaching people in person, kind of like training people already. I did spend about a little over a year, probably 2 years on the floor. And then I just stepped away and just invested it all into the online space.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I was going to ask quickly, what are your like accolades look like, just for the people that are listening more to speak? So like, how many people have you coached to pro cards? How many wins have you got? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I don't know all the wins off the top of my head. I can give you.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, it is a good thing.
Means you're doing well. Yeah.
I can give you some stats from last year. So last year we won, just 2022. We won 2 pro cards. We had a second in the pro show with, I think, 3 top 5s in pro shows. We had 9 overalls or 8 overalls, one of the 2. I believe that's the kind of the majority. I don't remember how many class wins, because we had a lot of class wins, but I really don't count them unless they're overalls. So that was kind of last year in a nutshell. And it was a good, productive coaching year.
That's good. Which pro competitors are you coaching at the moment?
Oh man, what's my roster look like now? I've got quite a few now. So I think the most recent additions, or I guess the ones people would know the most, would be like Ashlyn Richardson. She's a WPD pro. She's going to be doing either WPD or figure. We haven't quite figured that out yet. And then I've got a lot of figure pros. So I've got Mandy, I've got Leslie, I've got Catherine. Who else? Man, I did not come prepared for that question.
Nah, that's all right. Do you know roughly how many pros you're coaching at the moment?
I think it's about 9.
Okay.
9.
Not bad. That's quite interesting that you do coach a fair few figure athletes as well, because not something that's really spoken about as much either, at least here. In Australia, figures not extremely popular.
Very popular,
it's really popular here, and I honestly coach probably more figure than any class that I coach outside of classic physique, because I've just done very well in figure. And it's kind of led to me coaching a lot of figure as a result.
See, I personally think that whether it could be a preference thing as well, but one of the things which is, well, in Australia, very, very behind, female PED practice is atrocious. Like, I could not name you a coach here who would have any idea how to handle an athlete like that. Like, it would just be Anava, clean. Like, the best. Yeah.
That's kind of why we developed the whole female module, right? Is like, I think that's probably why I get the percentage of female clients I do is I'm very passionate about the process of taking a female through the journey of physique competing in physique sports. Because I think if you're not very accurate with what that person wants out of competing, you can put a female in a really bad spot really quickly relative to males. Like there's quite a bit more flexibility in PED protocols where you can kind of get away with stuff and people not realize it. And that's why we developed the whole female module, was to teach people everything you would need to know from no matter the level of female client that comes in. Is like the entry-level competitor that's never done it before and is learning about the industry, all the way to the top-level pro who's competing at the highest stage. It's like those two are way different. And even like as content and it's popularized around female PED use, I have a huge pet peeve with how it's even discussed and now, because it's so variable. It's you can't say one thing is the gold standard or one thing is the way to do it, because the variability in presentation with female health and the reality of it is so high that you have constructs and concepts that you can operate off of, but man, it looks so variable on the client-to-client basis.
Yeah. And there's a lot more moving parts as well, which is why I think people stray away from it. Because like I said before, I have one friend who I can probably have conversations about female PEDs with, and it's not my forte by any means. You'd know her, she's great. But beyond that, it's actually quite embarrassing, if I'm honest. You mentioned like our females and testosterone, and they're like, what, are you going to turn her into a man? And it's like, okay, like just stop talking, man. But like, it's not because they don't know any better, but you should probably not be approaching a client like that if you don't know any better. Like I'd be first to say, like if I had someone at that level, well, I wouldn't be 110% confident, you know what I mean? But I wish that was kind of the consensus across the board as well.
I think it's an ego thing too, right? Like I think a lot of people don't want to admit they haven't done it before, they can't do it yet, or even if that's the case, like just offsetting that into a mentor relationship, right? Like there's a lot of people, I coach a lot of coaches nowadays, and there's a lot of people I've helped prep their clients, and doesn't need to be publicly announced, just to give them the tools and the understanding of like being able to how to do this, right? And that's kind of where a lot of my passion lies now, is my development of my athletes to the point that they are now able to develop their athletes, and now the industry starts to grow as a whole, which is why like to me the athlete development process is on so many different levels, and it depends on what that athlete is doing. Like, are they strictly an athlete? Are they an athlete and a coach? Are they a coach first? Like, what does that look like? That process looks different for each setup that you have.
Yeah, of course.
I do definitely feel like that as a coach, you have to be to an extent willing to admit when you don't know something. Like there's no way you'd have someone come to you. Like a good coach wouldn't have someone come to them and in that same situation with like female PEDs and be like, yep, let's do it. But then have absolutely no idea about what they're doing. Like you would not be able to just take someone on board and be able to do that unless you're sort of letting them know that it's like, hey, I'm just letting you know, I don't really know a lot about it, but I'm happy to learn along the way.
And there's some like super high level functional health stuff that I'll pass on to some friends of mine who do that very well, just because like I have not spent the time doing that stuff to warrant me coaching that person. And honestly, it's not a big part of what I do as a prep coach, right? I know enough functional health to keep my athletes safe while we pursue the highest level of competing. And that's kind of where I draw the line. But when it comes to like complex functional health problems that take, probably years to fix, that's something that like, just as an example for me, like I'll pass that pretty quickly just because it's not that I probably couldn't figure it out. It's that the time spent figuring out is outside the scope of the direction I want to work in. So
sure.
I really need to just focus on that. And I think if people had a little bit of an understanding of the direction that they wanted to go, which comes down to branding, right? Like, what does your brand look like, and what does that 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan look like as far as what you want to develop into a brand? You would be able to be a little bit more objective with it and not have your ego hurt by saying, hey, this is not something I want to handle because of XYZ, right?
Yeah.
Because if you had direction on that and you didn't know how to do something that was pivotal to moving your business in the direction that you wanted it to go, you would invest in continued education to learn that skill so that you could continue to move your business in the right direction. Right. And so then now you're coming into that problem less and less, where you're really getting to a point where you don't have to refer out because you know how to handle everything, and your branding is driving the type of clients that you're getting. And so now you're creating a coach that's able to handle pretty much anything that comes across their desk.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, just sort of jumping back a little bit too. So even if you do take on those kind of functional, I guess, health issues, a lot of the times I find the clients, the application's not say, but like a bodybuilder. Then as a result, you're put in a position where it's like another moving part where it's just so difficult because you have to almost manage their psyche as well as give them the inputs to put in it, like the inputs and outputs. And then as a result, I feel like sometimes, well, for me personally, I've had instances where I'll say to the client, look, man, like, I'm not helping you here. Like, you need to go elsewhere. And that's just because, like, my approach isn't tailored towards, I guess, managing some kind of health issue. It is to an extent, but it really comes down to the individual. And in most cases, if it's a normal person, it's not going to work out. And you can't give them, I personally have to be upfront if I feel like it's not working out. I'm always transparent. I'm not going to hold a relationship for the sake of an income.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Especially
an important trait to have too, right? Like, you're hurting the client more if you don't want to work with them. I think that's kind of where I'm at, is like, I want to do what I love every single day. And what I love waking up to is helping people pursue bodybuilding at the highest level. And if that's not what you want to do, that's okay. Like, it's nothing wrong with that. Bodybuilding takes a lot. It's very selfish. It's a lot of risk involved. But if that's not what you want to do, then I have people on staff that can help you, and they're very trained in those skills, or I have friends who can do that. Right. So it's kind of the direction things start to go when you
of course. So probably takes us to the next point. So competition prep timelines. So we'll obviously get into a little bit of what a prep timeline looks like, but like, what would, in your eyes, qualify a client as ready, both physically, psychologically, etc.?
Yeah. So we'll start physically. Typically you don't want a client outside the confines of 24 weeks of prep. So from a body fat percentage standpoint, so pretty easy to kind of map that out. You can get an estimate of body fat percentage, and kind of map that across an average rate of loss across the time per weeks, and then see how many weeks it would take them to get to what contest condition for that class looks like. Now, that's the semi-guessing part, because contest shape for a bodybuilder, and like, let's just use the female side because there's a little bit more variability. Like, contest shape for a WPD athlete versus a bikini athlete is two different ends of the spectrum from a body fat percentage standpoint. So that's kind of where the art of coaching comes in, and understanding how much weight you actually have to lose. I shared a calculation at the Dubai seminar, and kind of how to estimate that via using body fat percentage and the weight of the athlete to get an estimate of how much total fat there is on the body to lose relative to kind of like the operating percentage of fat for males and females, and what that looks like. So you're able to use that to map out the timeline. Now, is that perfect? And no, it's not. So in reality, what I like to try to do is keep them within like 21 weeks, because I like a 3-week buffer. So they should be coming to the contest prep at 21 weeks out. Now, will they get above 21 weeks out during the off season? Absolutely. There's going to be times where you're having a longer off season to take the amount of muscularity progress that you need to jump up a class or to jump up a weight class or whatever it may be. You're going to have to go above that. But that's where then the deployment of mini cuts comes into play, to then rip them back down to kind of like that area that you want. So that has to be planned out well, which is where the timeline planning comes in, because not only does the timeline tell you how long you need for a contest prep, it also tells you what does the prep transition phase need to look like, and it tells you how far or how high in body fat you can let the off-season phase go. Because if you know that off-season phase is then going into a contest prep, then you're not going to let that person get above 21 weeks out, right? That's just not where they're going to go.
Yeah.
But if it's not going into a contest prep during the next phase, then it's okay to go a little bit above that, kind of get up in that 24, 25, 26 week mark, potentially all the way up to 28 or 30, and rip them back to that mark that you like for contest prep with a mini cut, and then do a shorter off-season phase before you do prep. So physically, that's kind of where I like my athletes. Mentally is a tough one. And the reason I say mentally is a tough one is because you have a variety of different psychological profiles that you're going to coach. Now, I typically refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs for this is where are they falling on that hierarchy of needs? Do they do this for a sense of belonging? Do they need self-esteem? Or are they kind of at the place where they're trying to see, you know, they have all that. They're just trying to see how good they can achieve from whatever the top level of Maslow's hierarchy is on the blank. Self-actualization. So from a self-actualization standpoint, like where those people are going to be a lot different than the self-esteem type people. So for what I coach now, most of the people I work with are in that self-actualization point of the phase. So for me, psychologically, if they're struggling with things that are related to self-esteem or anything along those lines, or there's like family dynamics that are contributing to that negative emotional state, that's kind of where we start to need to have conversations about, are you ready for this type of stuff? Common ones you'll run into as well is like food obsession before prep starts. That's a tough one to deal with. And then also people that are a little bit more addicted to body composition. So they really struggle to do off season because it's not contest prep shape. Now, these are typically the athletes that are easier to get in shape, but it's harder to put them on stage better every time you put them on stage. Which then takes a lot of work because you need to detach themselves from their physical presentation in the moment so that they can take the time to improve. And that's probably the hardest one to work with as far as the psychological profile.
Yeah, it's like on that as well. Like I find a lot of people want to compete because they think it's cool. You know, I'm pretty sure we spoke about this in Dubai as well. Like they think it's cool. They like the idea of it. They think, especially girls, like they'd love to be up on stage in a bikini in the high heels or glammed up. They don't realize it's a lot of work, and they have to give up their personal life to an extent. Yes. And I often get girls who want to prep, and I try to make that super, super clear because I don't know if you don't really realize how hard it is until you're 6 weeks out from your first show. In my take, anyway. I remember I did my first show and I thought it will be great. I was like 14 weeks out. I'm like, this is fucking easy. And then it gets to like 5 weeks and I'm like what has happened? Like, this is not what I expected. But I want people to, I feel like it's important. I'm sure you can relate. Like, you need to make sure if you have a first time competitor that they understand that that's going to happen. Like it's going to
be hard.
They're not going to be able to go out on weekends, and they'll be like, oh, I'll go out on weekends. I swear I need. Like when you're 5 weeks out, you don't want to do that.
You don't even want to leave the house.
No, you just want to sit on the couch. You know what I mean?
I think it's not just first time competitors there though. Like I've prepped plenty an athlete who's competed 2-3 times and they haven't truly gotten in contest shape. And it's just a rude of awakening as it is for the first time competitor. And there's like, you can warn this athlete as much as possible and prepare them for it as much as possible. It's still going to smack them in the face. And honestly, and this is my take on it, this is going to be a little harsh, but it is what it is.
It's okay.
You'll really find out the people who truly love bodybuilding when they get in true contest shape for the first time. Because that experience of getting into true contest shape is not meant for anyone or everyone. And I think that's where you see a lot of these people that we're talking about before that do it for the culture or the glam or whatever it may be, male or female. You really see that person start to fall out of love with the process because they didn't realize the process was actually what it was to do it at the level that these guys are doing it. And that's where you get people who kind of lean into just the YouTube culture or whatever it may end up being in the fitness space, because competing in bodybuilding isn't exactly what they wanted, and it was a rude awakening. They actually did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can 100% agree. I'm sure you've got more experience than I would have with like individuals experiencing things like that later in their career. But I've seen people start of the career. It's almost like the first show. I was saying this to someone yesterday as well. I feel like if you take a lot of the people I get are first time competitors. I want to make that process as transparent and enjoyable as possible, because I feel like when they get to the end of that, they're either going to love it or they're going to hate it.
Hate it.
And I don't want to be responsible for them hating it. Yeah. Like I'd rather make that smooth. And if they know what they're getting into, if I manage the process well, if they're like on track and ready a bit earlier, obviously you would be able to relate. Like there's way less stress associated. And then they can actually get to those last few weeks and appreciate where they're at, rather than looking at the timeline and being like, holy shit, like I got 4 weeks left and I got 6 weeks left of body fat to lose. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's two sides to that coin though. So
Go ahead.
there's the coaching aspect of like what you're saying, and that comes with your coaching service. So you really need to make sure that athlete enjoys the process, because you're responsive with your coaching responses. You're touching base with them frequently. The time to duration for them to hear back with you is very short, or within an acceptable time frame.
Yeah.
That portion of the process is very enjoyable, and that's your responsibility as a coach to make it enjoyable for them. Plan it out in plenty of time. Make sure that you give yourself enough time to do the thing. Where I would potentially disagree with you a little bit is you're also paid to win.
Yeah.
And if that is not an enjoyable thing in order to produce that result, like you have to tell that person to sack up and make it happen, because they came to you telling you that's what you wanted. Now, this is a different story for people who are just prepping to enjoy the experience, right? Like, or just get that experience.
Just to compete.
Yeah. Just to compete. I think when you look at like actual prep coaching, I've had people who stopped coaching just with me or in general because I pushed them to that level that they needed to win. They win, and they realize that what it takes to win is not what they want to continue to do.
Yeah.
And at least you gave that to them, because I see that as a positive, because not only did you produce the result that they wanted, but now they've come to the realization that they were capable of winning, and it's not what they want to do.
Yeah.
And that's just the unfortunate reality of the extreme level of our sport, is like a lot of people will say it, but not a lot of people will enjoy doing it.
Of course. Bit of a loaded one here. So when you talk about sort of pushing those limits, are we talking, obviously we're talking around conditioning, output, whatever comes with it, but when it comes to PED practices as well, is there an instance where you would push that upper limit, and how would you sort of present this to a client in regards to, I guess, potential risks and how willingly would you, and what kind of thought process would you go through in your acceptance of potential risks deep in a prep, in line with blood work as well?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So it would depend on what I call the level of athlete. So I categorize, just for conceptual understanding, people into levels. So like 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. 1 being your entry level competitor, 4 being your professional bodybuilder who's making a career out of this.
Yeah.
Everyone lands somewhere in that spectrum. So the higher the level, the higher the risk that comes with that. Your job as a coach is to communicate that with the client. So I will never take someone out of their comfortable, acceptable risk that they have sat down and had a conversation with me on the forefront. So like if they're a level 2 client and we talked about this and we agree they're a level 2 client and they're okay with the risk of a level 2 client, I'll not do anything outside the confines of level 2 that would be considered level 3 or level 4 deployment.
And just to confirm, Level 2 client was 1,000 to 1,800 milligrams in a male, correct?
No. So level 2 was, for a male. Level 2 was sub 1,000. So level 3 would be kind of above 1,000 to like
Cool.
1,800, 2,000. So that's just androgen load. Obviously there's other things to consider like thyroid therapy and other compounds, but ancillaries. But yeah, so like I would not take that level 2 client outside the risk because that's what they told me they're okay with. So you can win at a very high level with a level 2 client. I've won overalls with level 2 clients at the regional level. Like you need to be better as a coach at coaching, training, nutrition, managing a prep to be able to do that. But that's okay because you're giving them the result they want at the level that they're desired. Now, where that conversation starts to come to a head is when they want to take it to the next level and they don't have the genetic capacity to do that without the next step in risk. And it's not your job to force that upon them. It's to present it to them and have them come back and tell you whether they're ready for that step or not. Now, no matter the level, lab work's being tracked every 12 to 16 weeks. We're checking those metrics. We're not letting them get outside the confines of something that would be dangerous. But you're going to have a level 4 professional bodybuilder whose career is to compete that you're going to have to make a decision whether, that next step is worth it or not. And that's going to be a conversation you're going to have with that athlete. Because you're going to get a lab work that's skewed and you got to decide if it's okay within the relative risk that they're willing to take. That just looks different for every client. So a little bit of a hard question to answer. I know where you're going.
Definitely a hard question to answer.
I would answer that with, I would never push someone outside the risk that they're willing to take because I'm having that conversation of what they're willing to do before that process even gets started.
Yeah.
But have you ever seen circumstances or lab work, etc., when you've had to say to the client, "Hey, man, we have to
don't do this.
we have to pull a pin on this, or we need to discuss this." Yeah.
I onboarded a client. This is like a month ago. I onboarded a client who wanted to prep. We had like 3 to 4 weeks before prep needed to start, and I was like, "Hey, I can't do anything until I have lab work in my hands. Like, I'm not going to tell you PEDs to take or anything like along those lines." So he went and got his PEDs. He went and got his lab work done, and his EGFR came back like 34, which if you don't know what that is, it's kidney disease going into kidney failure level. So I told him, I was like, "Look, I'm not prepping you with this. You need to go to see nephrology. I would suggest you consider stopping bodybuilding. Follow up with a cystatin C, obviously, just to get a double check because it was a creatinine-based equation that calculated that GFR. And we need to just kind of run through the gamut of making sure that you're not in a compromised condition, right? So there's absolutely instances where you just have to stand your ground and say no. If you lose a client, you lose a client. But I didn't. He was appreciative of that. He went to nephrology. Everything was clear. The cystatin C showed an EGFR higher. They did some extra testing through nephrology to make sure the kidneys were good, and we're good to go. So obviously, we still haven't decided whether that prep's going to happen or not, just because of that presentation and that trend down over the last 2 years with the other person that he was working with. But that being said, it's like, look, like you've got to be able to stand your ground in certain cases. And that's just the reality of coaching in our industry sometimes.
On the kidney function one as well, I feel like it's more popular now, but people are so worried about their liver, their acne, their hair loss, that kidneys
sort of get
brain,
put on the back burner.
Just put on the back burner. Now people are starting to realize, like, all right, kidneys are fucking important. Obviously,
very.
But like they'll actually take a beating, and it's not like they heal themselves. Like, you can reduce the stress, but and I feel like that has, I guess, emphasized the importance of things like telmisartan and stuff like that as well. General blood pressure management, and just, I guess, good habits overall, because we've seen some shit over the years, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's just health management, right? Like PED is going to have a negative effect on cardiovascular health, brain health, kidney health, just overall chronic inflammation, multiple various influences on various factors, liver health, which you mentioned. So you need to be doing comprehensive health checks. And it's your role as a coach to make sure that's happening. So from the cardiovascular side, like echocardiograms, stress tests, cardiac stress tests, calcium scoring, like all of that kind of stuff, and do the works on your client to make sure that there's not something you're not seeing on lab work. Because a lot of the issues you see in bodybuilding are not always acute; they're chronic.
Yeah.
So it's like build up over time that ends up causing that issue.
How often would you? Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, how often would you recommend anyone that's doing PEDs to get their blood work done?
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier. About every 12 to 16 weeks. Would be standard on lab work. Relative to the client is obviously the caveat here, because there's some people you have to watch things a little bit more closely, and so you're testing maybe one specific panel more frequently than that. But most of the time, it's going to be 12 to 16 weeks. Setting up female HRT is the exception to that, because obviously that's like a test retest system. But so they're a lot closer together. But that's kind of generally where most clients fall.
Yep.
And in regards to that as well, so one of the questions actually I've written down here, in regards to, like, I guess going back to PED practices with like the sort of blood, obviously we've gone from like a cycle on, cycle off process, which was obviously probably like quite old now. I don't think anyone really does that anymore. Then we've gone to a blast and cruise concept, which was obviously, for anyone unaware, you run your peak doses and then you go back to like a physiological range, or what people claim to be a physiological range. And now sort of moving towards a process where we find something a little bit more manageable, and then
you hold it.
Well, in my practice, you sort of try to sustain like as reasonable as dosages as you can within parameters, well, with regular checks. Is this the kind of approach you take towards the end? And when would you potentially deploy a cruise phase?
Yeah, so it's not too far off. I call them escalation phases and baseline phases. And so the hard part of this is, so we can talk about what's perfect on paper. So perfect on paper is like this escalation phase. You keep health metrics in check for a long period of time, and you're able to casually, or casually is not the word. You're able to bring someone up at a slow rate across the duration of an accumulation phase, where the health metrics are not the reason you're stopping the push up. It's the body fat percentage. It's the reason you're stopping the push up, right? So that's kind of like the ideal on paper. Now, the reality, especially with like higher level athletes, is the frequency in which they have to compete, or the frequency in which they choose to compete because they're very close, really shortens that time window sometimes. So you're still running escalations and baselines. It's just the rate of that escalation is a bit faster rather than the expanded model of it. And then obviously like the drop off into baseline is fairly similar, but that level of athlete has the baseline that's a little bit higher. So their baseline is still technically super physiological, because one of the discussions within level 3 and level 4 is like, what does it take to retain that amount of tissue? Different for every athlete, but for most of them, it's some level of super physiological exposure year round. Now, that baseline phase probably being like 300 to 400 mgs for a level 3 or level 4 athlete. But that's kind of the dynamic you're dealing with. So on paper, yes, we use this like longer term model, which allows us to escalate compounds based on need, and we're able to keep health metrics in track and keep that within the confines of what we're using to continue to push up. And then really, if you do that well, body fat percentage is really the only reason you would kind of pull back. Now, unfortunately, with coaching, that's not the case on paper all the time. You have people who miss a pro card by 1 spot or 2 spot. And so they have like 10 weeks for an off season before they have, so they do their post show phase. They have 10 weeks to grow, and then they're 5 weeks from
back
prepping.
into it.
Yeah. So it's like, you have to create the result too within the confines of the health metrics. And so it does look quite different in application a few times. I've actually got a few this year that are having to do something similar. And that's the only reason I bring it up, is because you have to be able to flex the model a bit, where from the outsider looking in, it may look like blast and cruise because it's a shorter duration exposure, but it's not blast and cruise because you're still bringing them up and down based on the need of the time frame. It's just the rate at which that need of the time frame is different than that longer exposure period.
No, cool. So obviously coming out of one prep, moving into the next, they would have So if you were to finish up a prep on peak androgen loads, assuming there would obviously be a drop off. Let's say in that instance where you said there was a 10-week gap, there would be a drop off in the load in the interim, correct?
Yeah, so it depends on the 10-week gap you're talking. So
Yeah.
the one I presented would be post-show phase at baseline.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
whatever baseline for that athlete is, that's typically 8 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then 10 weeks super physiological exposure, and then 3 to 5 weeks baseline again to set up a prep. And then you're kind of going into the prep. So that would be across that time frame. What is that? 22 weeks between the end of that one prep to the start of the next one. For the instance that's 10 weeks, there's another show. So you do a show, 10 weeks later, there's your second show. What might come down to some of the more harsher compounds. So like trenbolone may come out. You may titrate back on some of the lipolytics. But they're probably still staying on a relatively decent amount of androgen load because they can't let their body fat go up very high. So it will be reduced quite a bit, but it's not all the way down to baseline for most athletes. But that's also where planning the year better allows you to not have your athlete have to do that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And obviously, when we were away as well, we spoke a little bit about fertility. Do you see these longer term exposures having an impact on fertility? And obviously, you're getting ready to have a child, so that's obviously worked out pretty well. But yeah, what have you seen in your experiences? What are your take with the higher loads versus sitting at like a TRT kind of load, so on and so forth? Obviously, I have my kind of position on it, but like I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, so to me, fertility and bodybuilding are opposite goals. So if you want to pursue fertility, it's this way. If you want to go bodybuilding, it's this way, right? Now, does longer duration compound exposure limit your ability to have kids? The longer you do it, yeah, probably it does. But there's plenty of resilient athletes that are still able to have kids post bodybuilding, right? What I would say is you still need to communicate that risk with that athlete so they know the possibility of what they're getting into. Now, to actually pursue bodybuilding, you have to go above physiological normal range, right? So with super physiological exposure comes down regulation of fertility for the athlete. And the more time that you spend in a suboptimal environment for fertility, the more likelihood that you're going to have skewing in nature. So basically what that translates to is the higher the level of bodybuilding you pursue, the more likely you're going to have issues on the fertility side. So it's kind of like a seesaw, right? It's like,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, you could probably hang out at TRT. There's plenty of guys that hang out at TRT and are able to maintain fertility just fine, right? That's not a problem at all. That's just basic clinical hormone replacement therapy. You're starting to tip that scale once you start to get into like super physiological exposure and pursuing bodybuilding at a high level and competing. And then the more aggressively you do that, the more that scale's going to tip.
Yeah. And it's one of those things. Obviously, Luke, me and you had this conversation as well when it came down to fertility too. And it was just, it's sort of like, honestly, it's one of those things that sort of to an extent set me back. It was like, yeah, this is probably one of those things that I feel like you think about, but when you actually deep dive into thinking about it, you sort of pull back a little bit and you're like, okay, is this really what I want to do? Is this really how I want to push it? And with a lot of people, I feel like it's not a selfish thing, but at the same time, it's like a lot of people really do have to understand that with fertility, there is someone else that you need to take into account when you're going to start PEDs or you are doing them. You know what I mean? So do you have a lot of cases where this does become an issue with clients?
Where like the pursuit of bodybuilding is...
like has to go sort of on hold because they want to have kids or...
Absolutely. And it's not always the client or the athlete. It's typically the significant other that wants to have kids, right? And so they have to temporarily put it on hold. And maybe the best way to explain this is my journey, because my journey was not the easiest. So I dieted for a show in 21. I ended up not doing the show because I chose... My wife missed her pro card by one point and she wanted to extend her prep. And her second show was 6 days out from the show I was going to do. So I tabled my prep at like 4 weeks out so that I could be there for her. And she ended up not doing the show, which we won't talk about. So I go through like probably the best post-show phase and push-up I've ever had. I was sitting at like 250 with the best condition I've ever had in an off season. And Emily had what's called an ANH score comeback that showed her egg quality wasn't the greatest. Now, this can change and it can improve over time for some people, but it was a scare for her that was like, okay, I want to start this fertility process now. She's a pediatric nurse practitioner. Kids is her life. So like the idea of not having kids is not an option. So I made a decision for her, obviously what's best for our family to do that. Now, the reality of that is like, sure, on a scale, I was able to hold my weight between 245 to 246-ish. So just my normal drop in weight from peak androgen load to baseline. But the change in visual composition that occurred during that time of pursuing fertility was that the reality was I probably lost about 8 pounds of tissue. So just because the scale weight was there doesn't mean that the tissue stayed there, right?
Is that just due to like drop of androgen while you're doing that?
Yeah, so to retain that tissue that I had at that level, it took me about 300 to 325 milligrams a week.
Yeah, okay.
To maintain that.
Yeah.
And then you're going down to clinical HRT. It's like, I don't care how hard you train, man. I was still training just as hard. It's not going to stay on once you're past where your body wants to be.
Yeah.
So it was psychologically a tough time for me, but we ended up doing IVF. So the reason I bring this up is not everybody is in a position where they can just jump into IVF. It's not cheap. It typically costs, depending on where you're at, somewhere in the realms of 18 to 26 grand. So you're looking at like a pretty steep investment to do it. And so, I mean, we're blessed and we're lucky where that was an option on the table, but that was the reality. And us having kids was like, we went through that IVF process and that's what we had to do. Otherwise we probably would have been trying to get pregnant for 1 to 2 years, which Emily didn't want to do. I didn't want to do. So we were able to make that choice and do that. But I had already accepted the fact that that would probably be the reality when I started bodybuilding before I even met Emily. And so some of that retrospection, like to be able to share that with other people is where I start to try to go. It's like, look, you may be by yourself right now and you don't give a flying fuck whether you have kids or not. But there may be a day where that's not the case anymore. And so you need to be okay with the fact that there's a possibility that might be a conversation you have to have with your significant other. Now, what's the incidence of that? It's probably not the highest. Like there's plenty of people who still restore fertility and get pregnant and after years of compound use. So it's not a guarantee that you're going to have it, but it's probably very likely that you'll be able to restore it. So I like to present the worst case because you may not be the worst case, but you need to know that that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the larger studies I've referenced before, it was something like 99%. It was a large study. I can't remember exactly how many participants were in it, but it was basically TRT patients discontinuing TRT for fertility. And it was above 99% of patients within 18 months came back to like, well, what was considered acceptable in regards to sperm count. And I presented that to clients before and a lot of them clutch at it. But the thing is, like you just said, you didn't want to try for 1 to 2 years. That means you have to come clean for 18 months. I think it was 67% at 12 months as well. And these guys are on like probably 100 to 125 milligrams a test. They're not going, they weren't anabolic. There was anabolic steroid users in it, but the majority. And that I think is a consideration itself, because if you're balls deep in bodybuilding, the last thing you're going to want to do is come clean for 18 months or come to nothing. It'll take you 12 months for your testosterone just to come back. Well, if you wanted to say for a certainty, that's assuming that it comes back. So it wouldn't be a great 12 months, would it?
No, I mean, and I lost 8 pounds of tissue in like a little over 6 or a little under 6.
Yeah. And that was still on TRT. That's without the complete trough in androgens. as well, like obviously HCG, HMG, Clomid. What are your thoughts on those for
Yeah,
restoring
no,
on
absolutely.
cycle fertility? Yeah.
HMG is ideal. We have plenty of evidence to
Mm-hmm.
show
Mm-hmm.
that the outcomes there are higher,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really fucking expensive. So the
Mhm.
reality
Yeah.
of it is, ACG and Clomid is typically the way most people go, just from a cost
Mm-hmm.
perspective. Um,
Mm-hmm.
plenty of efficacy behind it. Just sometimes longer time duration. People get a little impatient with it because they don't fully understand, like, the life cycle of sperm is about 90 days. So
Yeah.
depending on where you catch that life cycle, it could take 3 months to restore pretty much any fertility metrics, because
Mm-hmm.
you have to let those sperm go through the life cycle. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, some people in three
Mm-hmm.
months they're like fully fertile and it's not a problem and they get pregnant and good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Some people it's like 9, 10, 11, 12 months. And just depends on how many problems you're trying to combat. Is it one person or is it both people? Is it
Mm-hmm.
extreme in the how bad the motility is, or is it coming back pretty quickly? Like there's a lot of moving parts too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen some guys like absolutely not abuse, but go hard for extended periods, and their sperm count's still ridiculous. And then other people will say, "Oh, but this guy's sperm count was really good, and he just had 3 kids." And it's like, but that's not you. Like you
Yeah.
have
It's a
no
genetic
idea.
factor. Yeah.
It's like even just drawing. Like I feel like I've because we've spoken about so much here. I've jumped between topics. It's just like things interesting. Um, you hear about like, for example, someone will reference a friend who's on a really high trend exposure or who's using Boldenone and he's been fine and no deterioration of any health markers or blood volume increases. And it's like, yeah, my friend's doing it and it's fine. Like, and his coach's clients are doing it, and it's like, that
It's
doesn't
not
mean that
you,
it's
mate.
right. It's not you, and
Yeah, it's
just
not you.
because you don't just start introducing something and then 4 weeks later your health's fucked if it's bad for you. Like
Yeah.
it's
Right.
an accrual over time. Because yeah, actually, one of the big things that is still used here is boldenone as well. And talking people out of that is like
Tough.
painful, like fucking
Yeah.
painful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of it's just presenting the facts, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
have things that mechanistically work in the same manner, that are going to create the same amount of influence. We know milligram per milligram, a lot of these anabolics are very similar in the amount of tissue accumulation that occurs. So,
Mm-hmm.
Baldenon not really making it through human clinical trials, and some of the
Mm-hmm.
issues with potential blood volume, which you cited, and renal toxicity and stuff, kind of makes you want to table it, right? Pretty
Yeah.
quickly. Not something
Mm-hmm.
I'll deploy, right? So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it's conversations. It's just objectively presenting the facts to clients and saying, look, like I can create this outcome with a safer way of doing it. It's not going to change the results. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to create the same results, if not better results, because we're going to
Mm-hmm.
keep your health in a better spot. But we're able to elicit the same effect with these compounds without using this compound that's not clinically hasn't made it through human clinical trials. So it's just kind of one of those things, right? Like it's how you convey the message to clients a lot of times creates the buy-in,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of how you need to go about it.
I do feel
Mm-hmm.
like you do get a lot of stubborn people though. Like you'll have people that are sort of sit there and it's like, oh, my mate from the gym does it and he looks wicked. So it's like, why don't I do it? And it's like, yeah, but your mate is gonna be like, has your mate done
Your
blood
mate's
work
an
to see
idiot.
where he's sort of at?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, your mate, literally, your
Yeah.
mate's an idiot. Like,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
there's so many things, and it's like I feel like there's two ends of the spectrum to it as well. It's like if you're competing and doing whatever, it's a whole different realm. But like if you're just doing it because you want to look good through life and whatever, it's like, man, you really have to take a look at yourself because long term health wise, like you are not going to be in a good position. Like, and what
And
just to
these
look good when you go down to the beach, like.
these guys are like notorious as well for the ones that don't look after their health whatsoever. It's the guys that are competing are like right on it. It's the guys that just do it recreationally that like you have to ask them to do blood tests 6 times, and on the
Mm,
seventh time they'll get you half a panel.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know access to lab panels down there can be a little bit of an issue because I've had some with some of my
Um,
clients down there, but it's so easy.
Yeah, going to
bit
the
of a
doctors is
plug.
very
Uh,
difficult.
we do.
Um,
I use
we pay for them.
iMedical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's so easy here to get it done. So
Mm-hmm.
um A lot of it's an access issue, but yeah, a lot of that's just like how much are they bought into the process, right? Into wanting to do it right. Now, I will say I don't deal with this as much anymore because most people are coming in having a lot of exposure to my ideology and thought process.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I have people coming in the door, most of them are already doing a lot of the stuff that I've kind of talked about across various platforms, right?
Yeah.
So they've gone through J3U, they've heard my podcast, whatever it may be. Like a lot of them are fairly close. It's just kind of like optimizing that process for them.
Yeah.
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 There was one topic I did want to touch on, and I feel like it'd be important to go through. The reason I think this is important, because when we're in Dubai, I noticed the weight that you placed on. Hopefully, we can keep this nice and short. We've got about 20 minutes. I don't know how well that's going to go, but let's see. You place a lot of weight on your training setups and your training needs analysis, which is something, not that I haven't heard it before, but never with as much passion and attention to detail as what I heard with you. And that's what kind of drew me to you as well, because just the intricacies there were not intricacies to the point where it was complex for no reason, but it was just something that I've never personally had a coach approach in that manner. Usually, in fairness, until my current coach before that, it was always just like, just slap him something, which it's like, a couple of extra sets on the chest. Yeah,
here's the paper. Go do
it. Did you want to? I don't know where we start with that, but is it somewhere that you want to start with that, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no.
And sure. I have go
on. Look, I think as coaches, we would be idiots to not obsess over training. And it's not that training is overly complex. It's that it's the primary stimulus that causes hypertrophy. And if we realize that, and we need to realize that there's so many variations in how we can do that, where we're one, not caught up in a certain ideology, and two, we're able to flex methodologies in how we can create hypertrophy according to the client presentation, that's where we actually start coaching. And so there's two aspects to that. I think you're leaving a lot of wins on the table by not being that detailed with it. And then I think you're also losing the ability to be objective with the process if you're not that detailed with it. Because what you start to find out when you are that detailed with it is that there's multiple ways to skin a cat, but we have to be very specific with how we skin that cat for that individual. And so if we're not taking that amount of detail, and we can go through some of the steps of it if you want, you're really missing an opportunity to create a winning athlete. And a lot of the times it's very simple. It's just small steps, but then sometimes it's like this whole buy-in process that you have to go with an athlete. So a lot of it depends on where you're getting an athlete and how willing to work or willing to change they may be. But either way, it's just, if you want to be a coach that wins, I don't see why you wouldn't obsess over that. Because it is the most important stimulus that we drive as a winning coach.
Yeah, of course. No, because even you mentioned buy-in as well. I feel like just getting methodologies behind the clients can be a hard buy-in, because I'm sure you go through this more than I do. Don't get me wrong, I do as well. But I guess the concept that more is better, and just going ridiculous bouts of volume as well. But I also heard you, well, I didn't hear you. You were presenting a case where you had a guy training 4 sets of legs a week towards the end of a prep. Was this correct?
Yeah, I think it was 4 or 5.
Yeah. Yeah. How, and you also mentioned on that, so obviously you're low volume, high intensity guy, correct?
No, not necessarily. I'm a what works guy.
That was going to be my next point, because I remember you. Tell me if I'm wrong, because I might be mixing you up between John and Calum, but I don't think so. But just in case, even if that were your approach, you mentioned trying to find that point for the client, which sort of meets them where they are most comfortable executing, most interested, most enjoying the process, as well as finding what's, I guess, optimal.
Yeah. So, and I can clarify here. So psychologically, I sit on the lower volume side. Like that's what I just prefer to do personally.
Yeah.
Coaching wise, not at all. And the reason is because we have data that says like previous volume exposure can affect how well they respond to the following volume exposure in the next training block. So we have to take that in consideration. And then we also have to understand that not everybody is going to psychologically be able to handle the pressure of low volume, high intensity, right?
Yep.
Like that's just going to make people's anxieties go through the roof for some people, to the point that they're barely going to be able to walk into the gym because they're so scared that they're not going to progress a movement.
Yeah.
So with that athlete, you have to find where they exist on the spectrum. So the spectrum is, on one end, it's extremely high intensity and extremely low volume. Intensity not being load on a bar, intensity being proximity to failure.
Yeah.
On the other end, it's extremely high volume with extremely low intensity with a far proximity from failure. Okay. And everybody lives somewhere in that spectrum. So if you have an athlete that can't handle a lower volume, higher intensity approach, just move them along the spectrum to have some reps in reserve with higher set exposures and higher volume exposures that can create a very similar outcome. The one caveat to this is with higher level advanced athletes, that window of reps in reserve gets really small. And so you need them to start taking sets very close to failure. That it almost starts to turn into a lower volume exposure setup over time.
Regardless,
but just out of need. And it probably never really actually gets to, like if it's a higher volume client, it never really actually gets to low volume, high intensity. It just moves kind of into the middle of the spectrum. So that's why I'm not a guy. Like I'm not, like I have my psychological preference, but I'm not a guy that coaches X. Like I got to figure it out, whatever it is.
Yeah. What works for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Because admittedly, before we had that conversation, I was very much, this is my way. You stick to my way because it's best. I'm your coach. And then after hearing that conversation, I'm like, that would save me a lot of heartache, because the amount of times I've just hammered on the same person, and then just accepted like this is their program, but they're going to do whatever. But then to hear like, oh, you know what, it's okay to sort of just find that middle ground and find something that works. Like that to me was like, it was almost just like, oh, thank God. You know what I mean? Because I had a lot of trouble with that.
I feel like there is a good middle point as well, where it's a bit of a mixture of the two. And I do feel like, especially with a lot of clientele and a lot of work, that you find things that work for people in a sense where, low volume is going to work better for this movement because you understand that someone can hit failure on this movement, and it is a little bit easier to hit proximity of failure when you are doing a certain exercise. So I feel like you can sort of program it that way, where there are some exercises that, when you do have some people, it's like it starts to hurt, and it's like they don't like to do that exercise till failure because of the sort of the stimulus that it does provide.
Yeah, I think you need to work that client past that fear of that stimulus, because that's where the stimulus gets very high quality. I think more what makes that deciding factor for me nowadays is the anxiety around training and how does this client handle pressure. And again, I'll use myself as an example. I live under pressure very well. I thrive in it, actually. Growing up playing like high level competitive golf for almost 10 years, like it was me, myself, and I was the only one responsible for whether I won or whether I lost. And so I did very well in situations growing up in competitive golf where I was like down to the wire and it was on me and I pulled it off. And I live for that feeling. And so a low volume, higher intensity approach gives me that feeling a lot, because it's like you have this set to figure it out and make it happen, or you're not progressing this week. Right. So I do live for that. There's people who just don't handle that well, and that's like the last thing they need. And if they have that psychological stress on them in a contest prep, as an example, they're not going to progress from a fat loss perspective and present the best physique on stage. When you could have just understood that from the beginning and set up a program that's not quite as pressure driven with that. I will say the older I get, the more towards the middle I start to go. And then especially now with me hanging up bodybuilding, like I'm not plugging in headphones and blasting my eardrums out to the point that I can pendulum squat 7 1/4. But it's still kind of I need that pressure. So I still like
Mm-hmm.
create it in certain situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like with the logbook as well, I feel like a lot of like logbook, and you know what? Like, don't get me, I love my logbook, but and I feel like the logbook has become like this big ordeal recently, where everyone's like logbook, you got to write it down in a little book and whatever. But you're right, you do feel like there is a lot of pressure going into it. Like I don't have a book, I just do it on my phone, like through the spreadsheets. But like at the same time, it's like you sit there and you look at the number and you're sort of like, I feel shit today. So and then it's like you automatically get into the mindset. And it's like really going into the set. It's like me thinking like that. Is it like I'm probably not going to hit this now because that's like how I'm thinking and that's how the thought process is going. And like especially through prep when I prepped last, it was like I got to certain points and I'd feel shit and I'd be like, I can't do that. Let's just pull back this week because there's no way. But like, is it a mindset thing? Is it actually a physical thing? Like, you just don't know. And I feel like the body is so much better than you actually anticipate as well.
Yeah, which is sometimes where like psychological development for the athletes what's needed, because I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, if you went in there on a day you felt like you couldn't do it and you just kind of created the right circumstances where you were psychologically in a great spot, you would probably pull it off.
Yeah.
Um, because we're capable of a lot more than people realize. So
Yeah.
I think I think that's why my brand is no off switch in the pursuit of results, or no switch fitness, which is it comes from my personality, and that the moment I want to do something and I want to do it to the best that I can, I literally cannot stop thinking about it. And
Yeah.
I'm literally going to spend every waking moment doing it at the highest level. Um, the more I can impart that on the people I work with, the better they're going to be as athletes. And
Mm-hmm.
it might seem extreme, but we're in an extreme sport that takes that, right? So it just kind of is what it is.
Yeah,
Mhm.
for sure.
Do you often request videos from training from clients and things like that to assess? Is that something you're
Yeah,
big on?
absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
because I feel
I'll
like that's the
even,
best way to get that gauge. Yeah.
Yeah.
which to bring it back to the initial question, I'll even ask for it as part of the onboarding process sometimes, because
Yeah.
my needs analysis breakdown, it starts with a physique breakdown, but it also kind of goes into what is the development issues and why are we seeing that development issues, which oftentimes we're seeing the development issues because of movement issues. And so I'm proposing like theoretical solutions to what's the probable movement issue. And so sometimes I'll just request videos on the forefront to see if I'm in the right theory. And
Yeah.
Mm.
so like that's kind of why, and I said this in the seminar, my
Mhm.
training sessions that I send out to a client on the forefront are what I call dynamic documents, in
Mhm.
that this is what I think needs to happen, but I'm not going to know until I see you move and execute a lot of this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that could change rather rapidly. So don't get emotionally attached to anything in this plan, because based on what I see and comes back through to me, like this might change. So I'm really big on that. And that's why in the needs analysis I have to be so detailed, is because if I don't, I'm going to miss something. And if I miss something, I'm not providing the athlete with the outcome that they want, which is at the end of the day to develop
Mhm.
their physique to the point of winning on stage. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, because I typically ask for videos straight off the bat to make an assessment on that, but I find I don't really get a really good understanding until I've seen a series of videos. Um, because obviously you get an idea of how people move, limitations, what movements might be best for them, etc. But just to get less technical as well, let's say I was to program a pendulum squat. Failure on a pendulum squat sucks.
Yeah.
Like it sucks. It's not like doing it on like the hip press or
Yeah.
like a leg extension as well.
Right.
So
Yeah.
when you see that and you see sort of like the width of someone, gives you the opportunity to program effectively. And I feel like that's like you can't program movements that the person doesn't like. They're not going to push them. You know
yeah.
what I mean? Like I hate Smith machine barbell squatting. Like I said, Darren, there's no reason give me that because I'm not going to push it to failure. Like I just hate it.
Hate it.
Yeah, like it's my least favorite movement. Yeah, so I feel like yeah, there's a little bit of that comes into it too, just like simpler concepts as well. I'm
Mm.
sure you can agree with that too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The
Mm.
simpler you can
Yeah.
make it for the client, the better.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes important to get the two-way conversations as well, um, to make sure that you have got something in place which you're happy with, the client's happy with, and it's capable of progression as well. So if whenever I sort of go into a new training phase, I always ask for as much feedback as possible because I want to know what do you enjoy and get the most out of? What do you absolutely hate? And then the thing is, like, if there's a movement that they enjoy, they're far more likely to make it like go till failure and beyond compared to something they don't. So why would I not give them that movement which is enjoyable compared with, you know what I mean?
Yeah. As long as
Yeah.
they're able to provide the stimulus in that movement, then it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter.
Yeah, because the movement they can push is definitely better than the one that they won't. Yeah. Anyway, I guess we'll wrap up there, man. Thank you heaps for today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks heaps, man.
We had plenty more. We were like there was a few more points here, but we said we'd get carried away, and that's great.
We can do a part 2 in a later date.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, that would be awesome. Thanks, man. So did you want to just plug Instagram, website?
Yeah, this is my pimp myself out time, right?
Yeah, go for it. The female module.
Come on.
I keep saying it, Isabel. I keep saying it, Isabel, as a joke. Oh, when I got back from Dubai, whenever someone would ask a female question, you'd be like, "Buy the female module," and in the Texan accent as well.
I think the reason why I default to that, like, I'd still answer the question, right? But
of course you would. Yeah.
John and I spent probably 10 months building that thing out. And so it's so comprehensive, man. Like, it's as much as it is a teaching tool, it's a resource. And it's like, it's a one-time payment and it's so easy and it's a resource you'll use for the rest of your coaching career. So yeah, if you want that female module at J3 University, you can go buy that. That'd be great. But to find me, like, No Switch Fitness on Instagram, pretty easy. It's on all platforms. So YouTube, all the jazz. Got the stereotypical fitness influencer link in bio for anything else you need. But yeah, Instagram is kind of the best place to find out anything that we have going on, whether that's No Switch Fitness or J3U or whatever it may be. Which stay tuned for your audience because we are coming down under on the back end of the year. So
yes, you are. Yeah.
Announce those dates fairly soon. So excited.
That'll be good.
So like I've mentioned before, for anyone listening, with Luke is one of the better guys as a person and obviously as a coach as well in the industry. And I've been to a lot of, I'll give you a bit of a wrap here. I've been to a lot of workshops over the years and you're one of the people who captivated me the most. Which is why, like I've seen at least probably 30, 40, 50 people in person. And your presentations were great, just your engagement, your passion, etc. So whenever someone, like we confirmed this, every client that I work with, every friend that's sort of in the space said, if you don't know who Luke is, you need to follow Luke. Like it's almost like a disservice that like in Melbourne, you're less known than you should be, in my view. Yeah. And obviously even John as well, with like the large following, here it's still like getting the traction. I want that traction for you guys here because I feel like he's great. So I'm spewing
I couldn't come to that seminar.
You missed out, man. It was so much fun.
He didn't miss out on a 25-hour flight stopping in India though.
Yeah, but if we had gone together, it wouldn't have been that bad.
Delhi Airport's not great.
Look.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Anyway, man. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, and we'll be in touch.
Of course, man.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, man.
Take care, man.